There is a principle in military doctrine that has remained constant across centuries of warfare, from the supply lines of Napoleon's Grande Armée collapsing in the Russian winter to the fuel shortages that paralyzed German panzer divisions in the Ardennes. That principle is simple and absolute. An army that cannot be supplied cannot fight. It does not matter how well trained the soldiers are. It does not matter how modern their equipment is. It does not matter how defensible the terrain appears on a map. When the logistics chain breaks, the fighting force breaks with it. What is now happening on the Kinburn Spit, a narrow, sandy peninsula sitting at the mouth of the Dnieper Bug estuary on Ukraine's southern coastline, is a textbook demonstration of that principle playing out in real time. And the consequences extend far beyond this 10-kilometer strip of sand. To understand why this matters strategically, you first need to understand what the Kinburn Spit actually represents in the broader operational context of the Southern Front. This is not simply a piece of contested territory. Historically, naval commanders and military strategists have recognized this peninsula as one of the most controlling geographic features along the entire northern Black Sea coastline. Whoever holds the Kinburn Spit commands the approach to the Mykolaiv port, exercises surveillance dominance over a critical stretch of open water, and possesses the ability to project electronic warfare capabilities across a wide arc of Ukrainian-controlled territory. For the Russian military, this position was not merely a defensive outpost. It was an active instrument of strategic pressure, a platform from which signal jamming operations, GPS spoofing, and electronic interference were directed against Ukrainian communications infrastructure in the Ochakiv and Mykolaiv regions. Losing this position is not simply a matter of ceding ground. It is the forced dismantling of a capability that Russia has been exploiting for years. Now, the Russian command entrusted the occupation of this critical terrain feature to the 337th Regiment, an airborne unit operating under one of Russia's more capable Southern Front divisions. On paper, this was a reasonable assignment. Airborne forces carry a reputation for discipline, adaptability, and the ability to hold difficult terrain with limited support. In practice, however, the assignment exposed a fundamental mismatch between the unit's capabilities and the operational environment it was placed into. The Kinburn Spit is not terrain that rewards conventional defensive doctrine. The sandy soil structure makes deep entrenchment essentially impossible. The high water table in the region causes any dug position to flood rapidly, forcing soldiers to remain exposed on the surface or in shallow, poorly protected fighting positions. For nearly 3 years, the men of the 337th Regiment held this ground, not through tactical ingenuity, but through sheer endurance, enduring conditions that steadily degraded their combat effectiveness, their morale, and ultimately their will to hold the line. But the terrain was only one dimension of the problem Russia created for itself here. The deeper failure was strategic, and it originated not on the peninsula itself, but in the decisions made by the Russian command echelon far above the regimental level. For 3 years, Moscow maintained a static occupation posture on the Kinburn Spit, without meaningfully addressing the logistical vulnerabilities inherent to holding a geographically isolated peninsula. A position like this requires continuous resupply, ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, replacement personnel. It requires redundant supply routes capable of operating under pressure. It requires a command structure that understands the difference between holding terrain and holding terrain sustainably. The Russian command demonstrated none of these qualities here. Instead, they assigned a single regiment to an exposed position, maintained a thin and fragile supply architecture, and apparently assumed that the situation would remain static indefinitely. That assumption has now been proven catastrophically wrong. The internal deterioration of the 337th Regiment adds another layer to this analysis that deserves serious attention. because it speaks to a broader pattern visible across the Russian military in this war. During a rotation in the summer of 2025, a serious command crisis erupted within the unit. Violent confrontations broke out between the 337th Regiment's soldiers and elements of the Don Cossack Brigade that were replacing them in portions of the area. These were not minor disciplinary incidents. These were the visible symptoms of an institution under severe internal stress, an army in which trust between units has eroded, in which coordination failures are becoming normalized, and in which the foundational cohesion required for sustained combat operations is fracturing from within. The Russian military has been attempting to paper over these internal failures with elite reinforcements, sending special forces elements into the region in the spring of this year in an effort to stabilize the situation. But as we will examine more closely, that reinforcement decision carried unintended consequences that ultimately accelerated the deterioration rather than reversing it. What the Ukrainian military recognized, and what the Russian command apparently failed to appreciate, is that every reinforcement sent to the Kinburn Spit through already strained supply lines was itself a vulnerability. Each additional soldier, each additional vehicle, each additional ammunition load moving toward that peninsula represented a target in a logistical network that Ukraine was systematically preparing to destroy. Ukrainians did not respond to the Russian reinforcement with a conventional counteroffensive. They responded by tightening the noose, and they did so with a level of operational patience and doctrinal sophistication that reflects a military force that has learned, adapted, and sharpened its approach through years of brutal combat experience. The instrument of this strategy was not a single weapon system or a single operational unit. It was a carefully orchestrated multi-domain campaign that combined unmanned aerial systems, naval drone operations, special forces infiltration, partisan intelligence networks, and precision fires into a coherent whole. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces took primary responsibility for the aerial dimension of the operation, establishing persistent surveillance coverage over Russian supply routes and deploying kamikaze drone systems that operated day and night against logistical targets. The HUR, Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, contributed special operations elements that conducted infiltration missions from both land and sea, disrupting Russian defensive awareness and creating uncertainty within the garrison. The Ukrainian Navy's sea drone units established control over the waterways surrounding the peninsula, effectively closing off the maritime supply routes that might otherwise have allowed Russia to sustain its forces when ground routes came under pressure. Artillery and missile units from the Southern Operational Command maintained continuous fire support, degrading Russian defensive infrastructure and making movement within Russian-held portions of the peninsula increasingly costly. What makes this campaign particularly instructive from a doctrinal standpoint is the role played by the Atesh partisan network. Operating from within Russian-controlled or contested territory, these intelligence assets provided targeting data, observed Russian movements, and fed information into the broader Ukrainian targeting cycle with a degree of precision that conventional reconnaissance assets alone could not have achieved. This is an often underappreciated dimension of modern warfare, the ability to fuse human intelligence from embedded networks with sensor data from unmanned systems and turn that fused picture into actionable targeting solutions within seconds. The Ukrainians have developed this capability to a level that Russian logistical planners have clearly not fully accounted for, and the consequences are now visible on the ground. The sensor-to-shooter cycle that Ukraine has constructed across the southern front represents one of the most significant tactical innovations visible in this conflict. When a reconnaissance drone identifies a Russian supply convoy moving along a road in the operational rear, the targeting coordinates are passed to strike assets within seconds. The decision loop that in previous conflicts might have taken minutes or hours has been compressed to the point where Russian logistics vehicles are being engaged before their crews have any meaningful opportunity to react or disperse. Ukraine's 422nd Separate Unmanned Systems Regiment has conducted numerous documented operations against Russian supply trucks attempting to move ammunition and fuel toward frontline positions, converting those vehicles into wreckage at distances of 100 kilometers or more from the actual front lines. The message this sends to Russian logistics commanders is unambiguous. There is no safe distance. There is no rear area that is genuinely protected. Every road is a potential kill zone, and every convoy is a potential target. The cumulative effect of this campaign on the Russian garrison of the Kinburn Spit was total and predictable. First, ammunition deliveries stopped reaching the forward positions. Then fuel supplies were cut, immobilizing armored vehicles and making any dynamic defensive response impossible. Finally, even basic food resupply was interrupted, leaving soldiers in their waterlogged, exposed positions without the fundamental sustenance required to maintain combat effectiveness. At this point, the Russian command made a decision that, in retrospect, sealed the fate of the garrison. Rather than prioritizing the reinforcement and resupply of the Kinburn Spit, the command echelon redirected available healthy soldiers toward the Zaporizhia axis, a different sector of the front that was apparently assessed as a higher priority. The soldiers remaining on the peninsula were left without relief, without resupply, and without any realistic prospect of either arriving in the near term. What followed was not a military defeat in the conventional sense. There was no dramatic assault, no decisive engagement, no moment at which Ukrainian ground forces overwhelmed Russian defensive positions in direct combat. What happened instead was something arguably more consequential from a strategic perspective. A Russian military unit simply ceased to be capable of functioning as a combat force. Hunger, ammunition exhaustion, and the complete collapse of any confidence in command support drove the remnant garrison to abandon their positions without fighting. They withdrew first from the northern and western coastal strips, falling back toward the interior of the peninsula and then toward the mainland, moving east and south in what can only be described as a disorganized and demoralizing extraction. The forward lines of a position Russia had held for 3 years were evacuated not under fire, but under the weight of institutional failure. Now pause and consider what this means beyond the immediate tactical picture. A Russian airborne regiment, not a conscript unit hastily assembled from mobilization rosters, but an experienced formation drawing from one of Russia's most prestigious military branches, was broken not by firepower, but by the deliberate, patient severing of its logistical lifeline. This is an outcome with implications that reach into every other contested sector of this war. It validates a Ukrainian strategic approach that prioritizes logistical attrition over territorial advance, and it demonstrates that this approach can achieve results that direct assault might not, results achieved at far lower cost in Ukrainian lives and equipment. That calculus matters enormously when you are a military force that has been fighting a war of national survival for years against a larger adversary. But the Kinburn Spit operation did not exist in isolation. It was the visible tip of a much larger and deeper logistical campaign that Ukraine has been conducting across the entire southern theater. And to understand the full scope of what is now unfolding, you need to look not just at the peninsula itself, but at what Ukraine has been doing to the railway infrastructure that forms the backbone of Russia's military supply system in the south. Because what happened on a railway line running through Crimea in recent days represents a development of strategic significance that most analysts have not yet fully processed. Stay with this analysis because what follows explains the true scale of what Ukraine has set in motion and why the events on the Kinburn Spit are not the end of this story, but only the opening move in a much larger strategic sequence. The railway network that sustains Russian military operations across the southern front is not a secondary consideration in this conflict. It is the central nervous system of Moscow's entire logistical architecture in the theater. Understanding this is essential to understanding why a Ukrainian drone strike against a cargo train on the Jankoy to Kerch line in Crimea carries implications far beyond the destruction of a single locomotive. Russia's military supply chain, like that of most large continental powers, is built around rail as its primary means of moving heavy tonnage over long distances. Ammunition, artillery shells, fuel, replacement equipment, and reinforcement personnel all move through this network before they reach the roads and forward supply points that feed the front lines. When you interrupt the railway, you are not simply delaying a shipment. You are applying pressure to the entire downstream logistical sequence. Every unit that depends on what was moving through that line begins to feel the shortage within days. The Jankoy station sits at the geographic heart of Russia's southern military logistics. Every major supply corridor extending from the Russian mainland through Crimea toward the southern front lines passes through or near this critical junction. It is the point through which ammunition flows toward Kherson, toward the positions along the Dnieper, toward the forces that were until recently garrisoning the Kinburn Spit. When Ukrainian drone operations succeeded in striking the diesel locomotive of a Moscow-bound cargo train on this line and forcing the suspension of all railway traffic through Crimea, they did not simply inconvenience a logistics schedule. They severed the primary resupply artery feeding an entire operational theater. The downstream effects of that interruption compound rapidly. Units waiting for ammunition begin to ration. Units waiting for fuel begin to restrict vehicle movement. Units waiting for replacement parts begin to cannibalize damaged equipment. The operational tempo of the entire Russian southern grouping slows, and the capacity to respond dynamically to Ukrainian pressure diminishes precisely at the moment when Ukrainian pressure is increasing. This is not an accident. It is the product of deliberate strategic design. Ukrainian military has spent months constructing what can fairly be described as a comprehensive logistical interdiction campaign across the southern theater, a campaign that operates simultaneously against railway infrastructure, road convoys, fuel storage facilities, and ammunition supply points across a depth that renders no part of the Russian rear area genuinely secure. The integration of long-range drone strikes against fixed infrastructure with persistent unmanned systems operations against mobile logistics columns represents a qualitative evolution in Ukraine's warfighting approach. It reflects an understanding that in a conflict where direct confrontation along heavily fortified lines produces enormous casualties for limited territorial gain, the more efficient path to battlefield advantage runs through the enemy's supply system rather than through his defensive positions. What Russia has failed to adapt to, and this failure is now costing them in ways that are becoming increasingly difficult to conceal, is the speed and precision of the sensor-to-shooter cycle that Ukraine has operationalized across this theater. Russian logistics commanders are operating in an environment where the assumption of rear area security that has historically governed the planning and movement of supply convoys simply no longer applies. A fuel truck identified by a reconnaissance drone at a distance of 100 kilometers from the front line has, in this operational environment, a life expectancy measured in minutes rather than hours. The Russian military's response to this reality has been inadequate. Attempts to disperse convoys, move at night, or vary routes have provided some marginal reduction in losses, but have not fundamentally altered the equation. Ukraine's unmanned systems are patient, persistent, and increasingly capable of operating in degraded electromagnetic environments. The Russian air defense architecture that might theoretically intercept these systems has proven consistently unable to protect logistics targets effectively across a front of this depth and complexity. The Russian command's decision-making in response to this deteriorating situation has also revealed institutional problems that go beyond simple tactical miscalculation. The diversion of soldiers from the Kinburn-Spit garrison toward the Zaporizhzhia axis, a decision taken while the garrison was already under severe logistical pressure, reflects a command culture that responds to immediate crises on whichever front is currently loudest, rather than maintaining a coherent operational design. This is the behavior of a military headquarters that is managing emergencies rather than executing strategy. It is the behavior of an institution that has lost the operational initiative and is now reacting to an adversary's decisions rather than imposing its own. Every time Russian command pulls forces from one sector to stabilize another, it creates a new vulnerability somewhere else, a vulnerability that Ukrainian operational planners are increasingly capable of identifying and exploiting before Russian commanders can respond. The morale dimension of what has happened on the Kinburn Spit also deserves serious analytical attention, because its effects will not be contained to the soldiers who were directly involved in the withdrawal. In any military institution, the knowledge that a unit was abandoned by its command, left without supplies, without reinforcement, and without any meaningful support until hunger forced it to flee, spreads rapidly through the broader force. Soldiers on other sectors of the front are watching what happened to the 337th Regiment and drawing conclusions about what might happen to them if they find themselves in a similarly isolated position. The questions that follow from that observation are corrosive to military effectiveness. Will my command prioritize my sector when it comes under pressure? Will resupply reach me if the situation deteriorates? Is the chain of command capable of maintaining its commitments to the units it deploys? When soldiers begin asking those questions with genuine uncertainty about the answers, the foundational trust that sustains cohesive military operations begins to erode. That erosion is not visible on a map, but it is real, and it compounds over time.